Hey Michael, XForcePC way over here. This is one of our burn-in areas, and we had a bunch of customer systems burning in today, and they were all very different. So I thought it would be a kind of a neat thing to do is to take my kilowatt, which is a meter for measuring the amount of power drawn at the power outlet, and let's put a full load on all these systems and see how many watts they draw from the wall outlet. And that sort of gives you an idea of why we might put a particular size power supply in over another. And you know, lots of times we have customers that think, oh, I need a 1,000-watt power supply. And really you don't. You need the appropriate size power supply. Power supplies are most efficient when they're run between 50 and 80% load. When they're very, very underloaded, they're not very efficient, and when they're overloaded, they're not very efficient. So somewhere in the middle, anywhere really from 40 to 80% is where they're going to be the most efficient. So I probably wouldn't run a power supply at 80% all the time, but certainly okay for relatively short periods of time. So we're going to run through all these systems. We're going to tell you what's in them, and then we're going to tell you how many watts they're consuming. Okay, so this is my kilowatt, and so what I'm doing is I'm hooking this to every computer, and you may or may not be able to see here depending on the amount of glare, but this particular system is consuming around 230 watts. So this is our Intel mainstream system, and it's under a full load right now. The graphics card's fully loaded. The processor is fully loaded, and yeah, we're still hanging right around 230 degrees. This little kilowatt device is kind of handy. You can measure the voltage, the watts. You can also leave it connected for an extended period of time, and actually it will count up, for lack of a better term, the amount of power that's being used by a device. So you can then come back a week later and figure out how much is this thing costing you per month. It'll measure the kilowatt hours, and then you just look at your electric bill and multiply the cost of a kilowatt hour times the number of kilowatt hours this thing has stored in it, and you'll know how much the device is costing you over a period of time. So we're going to use this to measure all the systems and see what the top load is when under a 100% load. Okay, here are the contenders. First up is the Big Daddy. This is a Ryzen 3970X Threadripper, and that has 32 cores and 64 threads, and makes for quite an impressive task manager when you look at it. Very impressive task manager. It's got 64 gigs of DDR4 3600, and it's got an RTX 2080 Ti. So this one should draw the most power of all the systems. And moving down the line, we drop down a few notches here. This is what we call our mainstream system. This is an i5 9400F, runs around 4 gigahertz. It's got 16 gigs of DDR4 3000, and it's got a GTX 1660 Super. So this is a really good system for running X-Plane on a single 1080p display, and you can stretch it and even run it across 3 1080p displays if you so desire. Next is a system we're building for someone. This is a supersize ultimate package that they're opting for, and it's largely based on the RTX system. And this particular one, you can see the radio panel on top there. We hooked that up just for testing. This particular one has an i5 9600K running at 4.8 gigahertz. It's got 16 gigs of DDR4 3200, and it's got an RTX 2080 Super graphics card. Moving on down the line, we have here our mainstream Ryzen system. So we have a Ryzen 5 3600, which is a 6-core processor running around 4 gigahertz. It's got 16 gigs of DDR4 3600, and it's got a GTX 1660 Super. So it should come in pretty close to our Intel mainstream system. Then we move over, this is our highest end gaming system. This is a Super Type R, is what we call this system. i9 9900KF running at 4.9 gigahertz. It's got 32 gigs of DDR4 3600 RGB Pro RAM. And it's got an RTX 2080 Ti. This should use the second most amount of power, I would believe. And then last but not least, we have essentially a base RTX system. i5 9600KF running at 4.8. And it has a RTX 2070 8 gig, and it has 16 gigs of DDR4 3200 RAM. And that rounds up the list of systems tested. Okay, so that was quite interesting, although not surprising. So the highest one was the Ryzen 32 core with the RTX 2080 Ti at 671 watts. So if you had a 700 watt power supply in there at 80% efficiency, you know, you're gonna be hurting. So on that system, I believe I have 1,000 watt in there. At the very least, I have an 850, but I believe it's 1,000 watt power supply. Next was the Type R, our highest end gaming system, which we put an 850 watt power supply in and gold rated. And that came in at 568 watts. So you can see why we put an 850 watt power supply in there. Put a 700 watt in there, it's gonna be straining a bit. 850 watts, gold rated, no problem. Next was the RTX system, and that was actually running an upgraded graphics card with the 2080 Super, and it pulled in 421 watts. We run a 700 watt power supply with that one, so plenty of headroom there. We might put, there's about 3 different 700 watt power supplies we use, a white, a bronze, and a gold, and it sort of depends on what power supply you put what video card you put in that system, maybe what processor you put in that system, as to which 700 watt we may use. If you put in the 2080 Super and the i7, then we tend to use the higher end 700 watt power supply. Next we had the mainstream Ryzen running a 6-core 3600 and a 1660 Super. Draws 256 watts. We put a 600 watt power supply in there. Tons of headroom. Then we had our mainstream Intel system. We used a 700 watt power supply in there, and it was only drawing 230 watts. And I did leave out the base RTX system that just had the RTX 2070 in it. It was drawing 353 watts, and we use a 700 watt power supply in there. So as you can see, all of our systems have good headroom, but I thought you might be interested to see, you know, what do different configs draw from the wall socket under a full 100% load, which is what we were doing here. So interesting, but not surprising, at least to me.